The pattern reveals itself only to those willing to see it, not in prophecy or speculation, but in the cold arithmetic of empires that believed themselves immune to history's cruel mathematics. I have spent 4 decades studying the rise and fall of civilizations, tracing the fiscal skeletons beneath imperial flesh, and what emerges is not random chaos but a recurring sequence so precise it might as well be written in the stars. 3 great powers separated by continents and centuries: ancient Persia under the Achaemenids, revolutionary France under the Bourbons, and modern Japan after its miraculous post-war ascent. Each followed a measurable progression through identifiable phases of wealth accumulation, institutional strain, and systemic breakdown. The United States now exhibits markers consistent with the 8th phase of this sequence, the penultimate stage before total restructuring, and the evidence is not hidden in conspiracy or conjecture but visible in Congressional Budget Office projections, Federal Reserve balance sheets, and the widening gap between productive capacity and accumulated obligations. This is pattern recognition, grounded in fiscal reality, and understanding it requires we examine not just what happened to these empires, but why the sequence repeated despite different languages, religions, and governing philosophies. Before we trace these patterns across 3 empires and arrive at America's present position, I need you to stay with me through the entire analysis because the conclusion only makes sense when you see how each phase builds upon the previous one, how the numbers tell stories that politicians and central bankers prefer to keep buried in technical language and reassuring forecasts. Comment below where you're watching from, your city and country, because this pattern is not uniquely American, and I want to know how it resonates across different economies and political systems. The framework I'll present divides imperial economic trajectories into 9 distinct phases, each characterized by specific fiscal behaviors, institutional responses, and social dynamics. Phase 1 through Phase 2 represent dominance and wealth accumulation, the period when empires expand through military conquest, technological innovation, or resource monopolies, extracting value faster than they consume it. The Roman legions, the British East India Company, the American Industrial Revolution all represent Phase 1 and 2 dynamics where production exceeds obligation and confidence in institutions remains unquestioned. Phase 3 and 4 mark overextension, the moment when military commitments or welfare obligations exceed the empire's productive base, forcing deficit spending from structural necessity rather than temporary emergency. Rome's 3rd century crisis, Britain's post-World War I debt burden, America's simultaneous financing of global military presence and expanding entitlement programs all reflect the transition from surplus to structural deficit. Phase 5 introduces monetary manipulation as the primary tool for bridging the gap between obligations and revenue, whether through currency debasement in ancient times or quantitative easing in modern central banking. And this is where the mathematics begin their inevitable work, because you cannot print your way to prosperity without eventually paying the inflation tax or the deflation penalty. Phase 6 witnesses the consequences: either asset bubbles as cheap money chases limited productive investments, or wealth concentration as those closest to money creation captured disproportionate value while the productive middle experiences wage stagnation and purchasing power erosion. Phase 7 is characterized by loss of institutional trust, the moment when citizens begin questioning whether the system serves them or a protected elite, when capital flight begins and social cohesion fractures along ideological or class lines. Phase 8 brings visible systemic breakdown: market crashes, debt crises, political polarization so severe it threatens governmental function, protests in streets, and the fracturing of shared national narrative. Phase 9 represents total restructuring, either through managed reform, violent revolution, prolonged stagnation, or outright collapse, depending on whether leadership acts proactively or waits until crisis forces action. The progression is not inevitable at any single phase, but history shows that once Phase 5 begins, once monetary expansion becomes the preferred solution to structural imbalances, the subsequent phases follow with disturbing regularity unless fundamental reforms address the underlying productive-to-obligation ratio. Ancient Persia under the Achaemenid dynasty provides our first case study, an empire controlling nearly 40% of the world's population at its zenith under Darius the Great around 500 BCE, stretching from the Indus River to the Mediterranean, from the steppes of Central Asia to the cataracts of the Nile. The Persians mastered Phase 1 and 2 through superior administrative organization and the famous Royal Road communication system that allowed rapid troop deployment and tax collection across vast distances, creating what historian Tom Holland calls the First World Empire in his book Persian Fire. But Persia reached its natural expansion limits by the reign of Xerxes. The steppes offered no wealth to extract. The Mediterranean was contested by Greek naval power, and India's distance made further conquest prohibitively expensive. This marked the transition to Phase 3 and 4, where military spending remained constant or increased to defend existing territory. But new wealth extraction ceased, forcing the empire to live off existing satrapies without the continuous influx that had financed earlier expansion. The administrative costs alone were staggering: 23 satrapies, each requiring a satrap, a military garrison, a royal inspector, and the bureaucratic apparatus to collect taxes and suppress revolts, all while maintaining the royal capitals at Persepolis, Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, with their thousands of artisans, scribes, and hangers-on consuming imperial wealth. Phase 5 and 6 emerged as wealth accumulated in imperial treasuries while productive investment declined. And when Alexander the Great finally conquered Persepolis in 330 BCE, he discovered tens of thousands of talents of gold and silver hoarded in the royal vault, enough precious metal to mint coins that would circulate throughout the Mediterranean world for generations. That hoarded wealth represented the Persian Phase 6 problem: capital concentration in imperial hands, while the productive capacity of satrapies stagnated under extraction without reinvestment. Phase 7 manifested through increasing revolts in Egypt, Babylon, and among the Greek city-states paying tribute, each rebellion requiring expensive military campaigns that further drained resources without creating new wealth. By Phase 8, the empire could no longer coordinate effective defense when Macedon unified the Greek city-states and launched Alexander's invasion. And the speed of collapsed total conquest in less than 4 years shocked contemporary observers who remembered Persian power from the massive invasions of Greece generations earlier. Phase 9 was absolute political, administrative, and economic restructuring as Alexander's generals carved up the empire into Hellenistic kingdoms, each adopting modified versions of Persian administration but never recreating the unified system. The lesson from Achaemenid Persia is that vast accumulated wealth cannot sustain an empire when the structural costs of maintaining territory exceed productive capacity, and hoarding rather than productive investment accelerates the final collapse. Revolutionary France offers our second case study, and here the pattern compressed into decades rather than centuries, demonstrating how rapidly modern financial systems can traverse the 9 phases when monetary expansion replaces fiscal discipline. France entered Phase 3 and 4 through war financing: the wars of Louis XIV, the 7 Years' War, and critically the financial support for American independence that cost the French treasury over 1 billion livres, at a time when annual revenue barely reached 500 million. The historian Florent Naftalian notes in the French Revolution an economic interpretation that by 1788, debt service consumed over half of all government revenue, leaving insufficient funds for basic administration without new taxes or new debt, creating the fiscal crisis that would trigger political revolution. France attempted Phase 5 monetary solutions through the assignats paper currency, initially backed by confiscated church lands but ultimately printed in quantities far exceeding any backing, leading to hyperinflation where a bag of flour that cost 2 livres in 1790 cost 225 livres by 1795. This represents the clearest historical example of how Phase 5 monetary expansion leads directly to Phase 6 asset bubbles and wealth distortion. Those who held land or physical assets prospered, while wage earners and fixed income recipients faced economic annihilation as their purchasing power evaporated. Phase 7 manifested in the complete collapse of institutional trust. Citizens literally burned assignats in street protests, refused to accept paper currency, and returned to barter systems, demonstrating what happens when the medium of exchange loses credibility. By Phase 8, France experienced actual revolution: the storming of the Bastille, the execution of Louis XVI, the Terror, and the complete overthrow of existing political, social, and economic structures within a span of 5 years from the first fiscal crisis. Phase 9 restructuring was radical and violent, replacing monarchy with republic, aristocratic privilege with revolutionary meritocracy, and church authority with state secularism. Though it required Napoleon's eventual consolidation to create functional institutions from revolutionary chaos, the speed of French collapse from fiscal crisis in 1788 to Napoleonic restructuring by 1799 demonstrates that once Phase 8 begins, the timeline from dysfunction to total restructuring can be measured in years rather than generations. France's pattern also reveals that monetary debasement in Phase 5, while temporarily relieving fiscal pressure, ultimately accelerates the progression through subsequent phases by destroying the credibility of both currency and institutions simultaneously, leaving no trust reserves when crisis demands collective action. Modern Japan provides our third and perhaps most relevant case study because it demonstrates a different Phase 8 outcome: prolonged stagnation, rather than violent restructuring or outright collapse, what economists call the lost decades following the 1990 asset bubble collapse. Japan entered Phase 5 through monetary expansion designed to counter yen appreciation in the 1980s, with the Bank of Japan lowering interest rates and expanding credit availability, fueling a spectacular asset bubble where Tokyo real estate was theoretically valued higher than all of California, and the Nikkei stock index reached 38,915 in December 1989. Phase 6 manifested as wealth concentration among landowners and financial sector insiders, while ordinary wage growth stagnated, creating the illusion of prosperity through asset appreciation rather than productive increase. When the bubble burst in 1990, Japan entered Phase 7 and 8. Simultaneously, banks held worthless assets, corporations carried unsustainable debt, and the government responded not with restructuring but with repeated stimulus packages and zero interest rates attempting to reflate the economy. Richard Katz documents in the Japanese Phoenix that between 1992 and 2000, Japan spent over 100 trillion yen on fiscal stimulus with minimal economic impact because the underlying structural problems, zombie banks, keeping unprofitable firms alive, protected industries preventing creative destruction, demographic decline reducing the labor force were never addressed. Japan's experience represents Phase 8 without progression to Phase 9 restructuring, creating instead a zombie economy where GDP growth averages less than 1% annually, government debt reaches 260% of GDP, and deflation becomes chronic as monetary expansion fails to generate inflation or growth. The Japanese pattern reveals that avoiding Phase 9 total restructuring does not mean escaping consequences. It can mean decades of diminished prosperity, declining international influence, and the slow erosion of living standards as debt compounds and demographics deteriorate. For Americans watching Japan's trajectory, the lesson is sobering. A wealthy, technologically advanced, well-educated nation can enter permanent stagnation if it prioritizes stability over structural reform, if it protects failing institutions rather than allowing creative destruction, and if it uses monetary policy to mask rather than address fundamental imbalances between productive capacity and accumulated obligations. Japan has not collapsed in the dramatic fashion of Persia or France, but neither has it recovered the dynamism that made it the world's second-largest economy, instead settling into what scholar Richard Werner calls perpetual recession punctuated by periodic crisis, a future that should terrify any nation recognizing similar patterns in its own fiscal trajectory. The question that haunts every serious analysis of American fiscal trajectory is not whether the United States will experience Phase 8 dynamics, but whether we have already entered them and simply refuse to acknowledge the evidence accumulating in government reports, market behaviors, and institutional trust metrics that would be obvious to historians examining any other nation at any other time. The United States exhibits 4 distinct markers that correspond precisely to Phase 8 characteristics observed in historical empires: excessive federal debt with structural deficits requiring monetary accommodation, social fragmentation with declining institutional trust across every major sector, asset market distortions following prolonged monetary expansion, and global power rebalancing as competitors challenge American dominance in trade, technology, and military projection. Each marker alone might be dismissed as temporary or manageable, but their simultaneous manifestation creates a pattern that historians recognize even when contemporary observers prefer optimistic narratives about American exceptionalism insulating us from historical gravity. Let me walk through each marker with the same empirical rigor I would apply to Achaemenid Persia or Bourbon France, using Congressional Budget Office data, Federal Reserve reports, and academic economic analysis rather than partisan political framing, because the numbers speak independently of ideology once you learn their language. The first Phase 8 marker, excessive federal debt with structural deficits, is documented in the Congressional Budget Office's August 2025 baseline projections showing federal debt held by the public at approximately 100% of GDP, projected to reach 120% by 2035 under current law, without any new spending programs or tax cuts. More critically, the CBO estimates that net interest payments on this debt will total $13.8 trillion over the next decade, reaching $1.8 trillion annually by 2035, which would consume roughly 15% of all federal revenue just to service existing obligations, without reducing principal or funding any government operations. The average interest rate on marketable Treasury debt has more than doubled since 2022, reaching 3.4% in July 2025, the highest since 2008, and by the end of 2025, $9.2 trillion in existing debt requires refinancing at these higher rates, automatically increasing debt service even without new borrowing. This is Phase 4 transitioning into Phase 5 dynamics, where structural deficits, the gap between revenue and spending that persists regardless of economic cycle, require either explicit tax increases, spending cuts, or monetary accommodation through Federal Reserve bond purchases that suppress interest rates below market clearing levels. The United States chose Phase 5 monetary solutions after both the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic, expanding the Federal Reserve balance sheet from under $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak, creating what economist Mohamed Elerian calls the only game in town where monetary policy substitutes for fiscal discipline and structural reform. The historical parallel to France is precise. By 1788, French debt service consumed over half of government revenue, forcing Louis XVI to call the Estates General and triggering the sequence leading to revolution. And while American debt service has not yet reached 50% of revenue, The trajectory is identical and the compounding mathematics are unforgiving once interest rates normalize above the economic growth rate. The Institute for Fiscal Studies notes that when interest payments exceed GDP growth threshold, the United States is approaching debt becomes self-reinforcing because each dollar of deficit adds more to future interest obligations than economic growth adds to the revenue base, creating what mathematicians call an unstable equilibrium where small perturbations produce exponential divergence. Japan demonstrates the alternative path where central banks suppress interest rates indefinitely through yield curve control and permanent quantitative easing, preventing the debt service crisis but also preventing the creative destruction and capital reallocation necessary for productivity growth, resulting in 3 decades of stagnation with GDP growth averaging below 1%, despite massive fiscal and monetary stimulus. America faces the same choice. Japan faced in 1990 allow interest rates to reflect market risk and trigger immediate fiscal crisis, or suppress rates through monetary intervention and accept gradual stagnation as accumulated debt constrains productive investment and demographic change reduces the worker-to-retiree ratio from 3:1 toward 2:1 by mid-century. The second phase 8 marker manifests in social fragmentation and institutional trust decline measurable through Gallup polling, Pew Research studies, and Edelman Trust Barometer data showing confidence in government, media, corporations, and even scientific institutions at multi-decade lows across partisan divides. Gallup's 2024 Confidence in Institutions survey showed only 26% of Americans expressing confidence in the presidency, 12% in Congress, and 34% in the Supreme Court, with trust in media at just 16% and organized religion at 31%, numbers that would have been unthinkable during periods of genuine phase 1 or 2 dominance when institutional legitimacy remained largely unquestioned. This is not merely political polarization, but something deeper: the fracturing of shared epistemology where Americans increasingly cannot agree on basic facts about economic performance, public health measures, election integrity, or foreign policy threats because they consume entirely different information ecosystems that reinforce incompatible worldviews. Phase 7 in revolutionary France exhibited identical dynamics as aristocrats, clergy, bourgeoisie, and peasants developed incompatible narratives about who deserved wealth and power, with no trusted institutions remaining to mediate disputes or enforce compromises, leaving only force as the final arbiter when the fiscal crisis demanded someone accept losses. The American version plays out through political gridlock, preventing fiscal reform even when both parties privately acknowledge the unsustainability of current trajectories because any compromise requires some constituency accept reduced benefits or increased taxes, and no politician trusts that voters will reward responsibility over promises of pain-free solutions. This institutional paralysis is itself a Phase 8 characteristic, the inability to act decisively, even when problems are obvious, because action requires trust that sacrifices will be shared fairly and that institutions will enforce agreements rather than allowing politically connected groups to escape consequences. When trust collapses, cooperation becomes impossible even when cooperation serves everyone's long-term interest, and societies fragment into competing factions seeking to secure their position before the final reckoning. The January 6 Capitol riot, the 2020 urban protests, the trucker convoys, the school board battles, these are not separate phenomena but manifestations of the same underlying Phase 8 dynamic where institutional legitimacy erodes and citizens increasingly view political opponents not as fellow countrymen with different priorities but as existential threats to be defeated rather than negotiated with. France experienced this fracturing in the years between 1788 and 1792 as revolutionary clubs, monarchist sympathizers, constitutional moderates, and radical sans-culottes competed with escalating violence because no institution commanded sufficient legitimacy to enforce compromise. And the final result was terror followed by military dictatorship as the only force capable of reimposing order. If this analysis resonates with what you observe in markets, institutions, and political discourse, do me a favor, hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and activate the notification bell so you catch the follow-up analysis. Because understanding these patterns is just the beginning, and the implications for investment strategy, geographic positioning, and institutional preparation deserve their own deep examination. Also comment below with your city and country because I want to know whether observers in Tokyo, London, Sao Paulo, or Mumbai recognize similar patterns in their own national trajectories, or whether American dynamics reflect unique circumstances that might alter the historical pattern. The third Phase 8 marker appears in asset markets, exhibiting distortions characteristic of prolonged monetary expansion without corresponding productivity growth. And here the Japanese parallel becomes unavoidable for anyone examining price-to-earnings ratios, commercial real estate valuations, or government bond yields that would be impossible without central bank intervention. The S&P 500 trades at cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratios above 30, levels historically associated with major market peaks in 1929 and 2000. while 10-year Treasury yields remain below long-term inflation expectations, creating negative real yields that force savers into riskier assets seeking any return above inflation. This is phase 6 dynamics, where asset prices disconnect from productive fundamentals because monetary expansion channels capital into financial speculation rather than productive investment, benefiting those who own assets while wage earners experience purchasing power erosion as housing, healthcare, and education costs rise faster than incomes. The Federal Reserve's own distributional financial accounts show that the top 10% of households by wealth owned 89% of all corporate equities and mutual fund shares, while the bottom 50% own essentially zero, meaning that asset price inflation from monetary expansion disproportionately benefits the already wealthy while doing nothing for households dependent on wage income. Japan's experience showed that when asset bubbles deflate without genuine restructuring, the result is not return to normalcy but permanent impairment. Japanese stocks still trade below their 1989 peak 35 years later, and Tokyo real estate lost 70% of its value and has never recovered in inflation-adjusted terms. American policymakers studied Japan's lost decades extensively after 2008 and concluded they needed even more aggressive monetary expansion to avoid deflation. But the question they never adequately addressed was whether preventing deflation through monetary means simply defers the adjustment while allowing debt to compound, ultimately making the eventual correction even more severe when it finally arrives. The Bank for International Settlements research has documented that economies which experience credit booms followed by monetary accommodation, rather than deleveraging, tend to suffer longer periods of below-trend growth as resources remain misallocated and unproductive sectors kept alive by cheap credit rather than being reallocated through bankruptcy and restructuring toward higher productivity users. America exhibits classic post-bubble misallocation: commercial real estate overbuilt and repriced downward as remote work reduces demand, retail apocalypse as e-commerce disrupts brick-and-mortar, and zombie corporations kept alive through refinancing at artificially low rates who would fail if interest rates reflected genuine risk. The fourth phase 8 marker manifests in global power rebalancing as competitors challenge American dominance across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and while declinists have predicted American eclipse repeatedly since the 1970s, the current challenge differs in scale and comprehensiveness from previous episodes. China's economy reached parity with the United States in purchasing power terms around 2014 and now exceeds American GDP when measured by PPP, while producing more scientific publications, registering more patents, and graduating more engineers annually than America, Europe, and Japan combined. The Belt and Road Initiative represents the most ambitious infrastructure investment program since the Marshall Plan, creating Chinese-financed transportation and logistics networks across Asia, Africa, and increasingly Latin America that will shape trade flows for generations. BRICS. Nations are exploring alternative payment systems to reduce dependence on dollar-denominated trade and SWIFT messaging. And while the dollar's reserve currency status remains secure in the short term, the trajectory resembles Britain's gradual loss of sterling dominance between 1918 and 1971, not sudden collapse but steady erosion as alternatives emerge and trading partners diversify their reserve holdings. This parallels the Achaemenid Persian experience, where Macedon's rise under Philip II unified the previously fragmented Greek city-states into a military power capable of challenging Persian dominance, and the speed of Alexander's conquest reflected not just Macedonian military prowess but the accumulated weaknesses of an imperial system stretched across vast distances with declining provincial loyalty and exhausted fiscal resources. America's simultaneous challenges economic competition, Russian regional assertiveness, Middle Eastern complexity, European strategic autonomy efforts, and emerging markets reducing dollar dependence require resources and attention that exceed comfortable management even with unlimited fiscal capacity, and become impossible to address simultaneously when domestic fiscal constraints limit available tools. The defense budget consumed 3.5% of GDP in 2024 compared to over 6% during the Reagan buildup and 9% during Vietnam. Yet America attempts to maintain security commitments in Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and increasingly Africa and Latin America while the industrial base erodes and recruiting struggles to meet targets. This is phase 3 and 4 overextension, where commitments exceed capacity and every crisis requires choosing which interest to defend and which to concede, gradually eroding the credibility that forms the foundation of hegemonic power. But here the analysis reaches its crucial turn because unlike Persia, France, or Japan, America possesses something those empires lacked at equivalent phases: historical knowledge of the pattern itself and the agency to choose differently if collective will exists to make hard choices before crisis forces them. The American system has reformed itself before when circumstances demanded. Alexander Hamilton's assumption of state debts and creation of creditworthiness in the 1790s, the greenback financing and post-war deflation following the Civil War, The Progressive Era reforms breaking monopolies and creating regulatory capacity. The New Deal restructuring financial markets and creating social insurance. The Volcker inflation fighting in Reagan-O'Neill compromises on social security in the 1980s. Each episode required leadership willing to accept short-term political cost for long-term stability, and required citizens trusting that sacrifices would be shared fairly rather than concentrated on the vulnerable while the connected escaped consequences. The question facing Americans in Phase 8 is whether that capacity for collective action and institutional reform still exists, or whether polarization and trust collapse have eroded the social capital necessary for managing transitions without crisis, forcing brutal adjustments. Phase 9 historically takes three forms: total collapse, like Achaemenid Persia's conquest and dissolution; violent restructuring, like Revolutionary France's terror and Napoleonic consolidation; or prolonged stagnation, like Japan's lost decades extending into lost generations. America can still choose a fourth path: proactive reform addressing structural imbalances before markets force adjustment, but that window closes as debt compounds, demographics deteriorate, and institutional trust declines below thresholds where cooperation becomes possible. The path requires acknowledging that current trajectories are unsustainable, that monetary expansion cannot indefinitely substitute for fiscal discipline and productivity growth, that entitlement promises exceed the economy's capacity to fund them without massive tax increases or benefit reductions, and that global dominance requires resources America can only mobilize through domestic renewal rather than foreign borrowing. These truths are uncomfortable and politically dangerous, which is precisely why Phase 8 societies typically avoid them until Phase 9 arrives, uninvited, and forces restructuring under crisis conditions far more painful than proactive reform would have required. The American experiment was founded on self-governance and institutional adaptability, on the belief that free people can manage their affairs through reason and compromise rather than requiring crisis or strongmen to impose order. Phase 8 is the test of whether that founding faith remains justified, or whether Americans have become just another imperial population believing ourselves exempt from historical patterns that humbled every previous empire that imagined itself eternal.